Amy Sandler, the host of the Radical Candor Podcast. And you are in for a treat today. We have got a radically candid conversation ahead, welcoming back to the podcast Russ Laraway, author of the book When They Win, You Win. Being a great manager is simpler than you think. It's coming out on June 7th. Go ahead and pre-order it now.
Pre-order it now. Pre-order it now.
Sometimes I feel like I have Kim Scott's voice in my ears, and I think I do right now. Pre-order it now. When they win, you win. We all do. For those of you who also remember Russ's voice in your ears, you know Russ best as the OG co-host with Kim of this very podcast. Russ is currently Chief People Officer at Goodwater Capital. He's also the creator of Career Conversations, which is covered in Radical Candor. And Russ dedicates nearly 100 pages of his new book to career conversations as well. We are so very happy to welcome Russ back. And Kim, over to you.
Thank you. It is so, I've been looking forward all day long to this conversation, Russ.
I thought about starting off by saying the prodigal son returns and then quickly saying, just kidding, it's Russ. I didn't know if that'd be funny. Or not. So,
well, clearly I thought it was funny. I always enjoy talking to you. And I thought we would sort of kick this off by me sharing with everyone here some feedback that you gave to me when we worked at Google together, which feels like supreme irony. So I recall at one point at Google, you told me, you said, Kim, you value quantitative skills more than leadership skills, which was true. I remember thinking that it was really, unfortunately, true feedback. And I got to say, hopefully I've taken that to heart now because I haven't written a single word about measurement. So would love to get your perspective and memory on that feedback. And then we'll talk about your book, which I'm so excited about.
Yeah. In fact, in some ways, we might have each kind of come toward the middle a little more. So that the context is that, when I joined Google back in 2005, you, of course, were my boss. And I could barely add, as you probably recall. I couldn't add. I mean, subtraction
that is not true.
Subtraction was a really big challenge. But the company, I would say in hindsight, maybe that feedback was a little unfair only because ultimately, when I won the Google Great Manager Award in 2012, 7 years after I would have given you that feedback, when I was asked for my opinion about this sort of overall, they took us on a trip to Kauai with the 3 of the CEOs directs. I mean, it was incredible. And I said, in my feedback, I said, listen, I'm really appreciative of what you've all done here, but Google still does not care about people management. That was my exact feedback. Just because you gave a handful of managers a trip to Kauai doesn't mean we really care about it. So I just think there was something cultural there that heavily biased toward getting to the truth through math versus some of the softer stuff maybe. And of course, my bias was that all I really had, I joke about not being able to add, but you and I, Kim, nobody's confusing me for a physicist anytime soon.
Yeah, or me.
All I had was the soft stuff. And you were building a team of people that were really strong quantitatively, and I was getting ratings that strongly suggested that I was not as quantitative as the rest of them. And so there's the feedback. I mean, but you know what? I'm sorry. I'm just going to take 1 second. I've said this on a few other podcasts now. What is the most important takeaway is that you created a culture in which your direct report felt like they could say something like that to you without fear of retaliation. And I can prove to you, and maybe we'll get there in a bit on the ROI of some radical candor stuff. I can prove to you how important it is for a manager to enable that kind of culture.
See, unlike me, you've been able to quantify the value of radical candor. I've never even tried. In fact, anyway, there's more funny stories, which we can tell towards the end. But I think this is really an important point. I mean, I think one of the things that you and I talked a lot about, both at Google when we worked together and when we co-founded this company that was where we were trying to build this Candor app, we talked about how in Silicon Valley, specifically and kind of in corporate America more broadly, management is neither taught nor rewarded. And I think that's beginning to change, but not quite fast enough. So I would love to get your thoughts on, is that still true? Is it changing? Why is it changing? Why is it not changing fast enough?
Yeah, probably probably not changing to not changing fast enough is my rough take. Just having looked at sort of the research and how I arrive at that conclusion. Excuse me. By the way, it's an incredibly counterintuitive conclusion because what we're doing right now, the books that you wrote, the book that I wrote, the books that are being written every day, articles in HBR and everywhere else, all have a singular aim. Many have a singular aim, which is to help managers become better at their jobs. And yet, the evidence that I came across strongly suggests managers are at best stagnant as more and more content comes out. I have this fantasy, if you'll indulge me for a minute, which is I get a chance to ask every person, every individual who's written a book, who's hosted a podcast or written an article, I get to ask them, how do you think your stuff helps managers become better at their jobs? And then the way this fantasy goes is they would each never use these exact words, but they would say something like, it's like going through an a la carte or buffet style lunch line, right? And so the manager scoots along at a leisurely pace. They pull a little off the Kim section, they pull a little off the Russ section, then they're over to the Bernays section, and they're just scooting down the line. They grab something from the Simon section. These aren't real people; these are just random names.
And just theoretical names.
Yeah, and then they walk away with a tray full of nutritious food, or what they need to solve any leadership problem that comes their way. And what I realized for most managers is it doesn't feel at all like a leisurely trip through a lunch line. It feels like you're hogtied in the center of a middle school cafeteria while a multi-thousand person food fight's transpiring with like broccoli bouncing off your head or mashed potatoes sliding down your cheek.
It's like worse, a food fight.
Yeah, exactly. And worse is if you were going through the leisurely lunch line, you're not picking chicken breast and broccoli and spirulina shake that you need. You're picking the chicken fried steak, the cream puffs, and the cheesesteak that you want. And that process of opting in is heavily fraught with bias. And so it's just tough. There's so much stuff out there and it doesn't hang together. And practically, I think this has led to a pseudo conclusion that managers aren't actually improving as a result of all of our effort.
So how do we fix this? And also, how do we, this is something that you and I used to talk a lot about as we were building this sort of candor coach, is you need a coherent management philosophy. You need stuff that hangs together where one thing reinforces the next thing. So I guess I'm asking you two questions in one. One, how do we fix it? But two, how would you articulate the coherent management philosophy that you do articulate in When They Win, You Win? And by the way, buy the book. That's to the listeners, not to you. You already bought it.
I did. I actually own a few. I already own a few copies. I just found out I'm contractually obligated to like 20 copies or something. So that's fun. Actually, I think the first issue is a process issue. And so I have this model I came up with, which is called stack. Like we're going to stack up a bunch of great managers because we're going to select, teach, assess, and coach them better. And so the first problem, Kim, that leads to managers flailing is they're selected for the wrong reasons. They're selected because like, in the food industry, they're selected strictly because of tenure. Like you're still here, you're the manager, But in the rest of the world, we actually pick managers based on how good of an individual contributor they were. And the problem with that, of course, is the activity. You know this better than anybody. The activities that make you successful as a manager look nothing like the activities that made you successful as an individual contributor versus selecting someone for their leadership chops, right?
Yeah. And leadership love. I mean, like there was at one point I was at Apple and I was teaching this class, managing at Apple. And we always tried to get these senior leaders from Apple to come and introduce the class. And we brought in this one engineering leader. Nobody had told me that he didn't actually manage people. And he stood up in front of the whole class and he said, I have one deal with Apple. They don't ask me to manage and I don't quit. I was like, oh my God, this is not exactly the inspiration that I was looking for. So clearly like there was some lack of awareness there. about the kind of people who needed to be teaching this class and the difference between management and very senior leaders who are individual contributors.
Yeah, couldn't be more different. By the way, picking up on teach, I think probably two big problems I see with respect to the teach part of Stack. Problem number one is, and I didn't realize this was a problem until I went through the 5+ year process of writing this book. And the experience at Qualtrics really galvanized sort of the ideas. But first is that the leadership standard being taught is almost never held to any sort of measurable account. So there's a prescription with zero accountability of whether that prescription works. And now I've chosen to define works as measurably and predictably leads to more engaged employees or work happiness and better business results. But I'd take just about anybody's definition. I just think there needs to be some accountability for the leadership standard being prescribed. So that problem one is you're just trotting stuff out with no accountability. The flip side of that is the teaching is often unfocused. And so, because like leadership is highly susceptible to like senior person flavor of the month. Like CEO heard about situational leadership on some Zoom call, and next thing you know, everybody's doing situational leadership. And then, by the way, repeat that because now you hire the L&D person and they've done their research in a certain area and they want to drive the leadership stuff in a different direction. And then new executive, and next thing you know, you have this Frankenstein monster that at least Frankenstein walked and made noises. This one just lays on the table and does nothing, right? So you have this Frankenstein monster of leadership stuff that, again, like you said, isn't coherent, doesn't hang together. But worst of all, no one's attempted to hold it to any sort of accountability of whether it does what it's promised to do. So I think that's probably the biggest.
I think there's also, before we move on to the AC part of Stack, you taught me a lot about teaching leadership when we were at Google together. I remember, you correct me, you probably remember the conversation a little differently. But you came in to my office and you said you wanted to fly the managers on your team from all over the world and teach them how to have get to know you conversations. I think I was probably not very respectful or caring in how I kind of poo-pooed this. I dismissed this. And you said, look, one of the things that you had learned over the course of your career, especially in the military, is that in order for your people to become great leaders, you have to teach them certain skills, including like the fact that it is their job to get to know their people and how to do that and how to do that correctly. And somehow I realized that I had this kind of bias in the back of my mind that leadership was almost like a personality attribute as opposed to a skill that we can teach and a skill that we can learn. And I think that was actually a really transformative moment for me in my career and in thinking about leadership, because I think too often we commit the fundamental personality attribute error when what we should be doing is realizing this is a skill that people can learn.
You weren't alone then, and if you still believe that today, which I know you don't, you still wouldn't be alone today. Like one of the worst words that gets thrown around when it comes to leadership is charisma.
Yes.
It's just like it's you can be an incredibly good manager and have zero charisma. In fact, you can be one of the best managers around. And you kept saying the word skills. I'm going to refine this a bit if I may. What I think the conclusion I reached and sort of what I kind of push in the book is it's actually behaviors. So leadership is ultimately, I think, really a set of behaviors that when practiced regularly and practiced sort of correctly, and then we'll get to the A and the C part, which are how you really do that. That's how you become a good leader and a good manager. By the way, I don't care about the distinction between those two. Happy to chat through that as well. I no longer care about the difference between leadership and management. Like I'll say it just to sound cool at a cocktail party, but I don't really believe it.
There is, I agree with you. I think you and I have always agreed on that. There's so much leadership sort of means to a lot of people a person who, sits around and BS's and doesn't actually do anything. And managers kind of imply, a small-minded paper pusher. And neither one are fair to either set of behaviors. I like behaviors better than skills. I agree with you. And it's hard actually to write a book about this because all of the words leader, manager, boss have these very strong negative connotations in the minds of a lot of people. So did you come up with a better word, or are we just stuck with these words that people have negative connotations about?
Definitely didn't come up with a better word, but I came up with a better way of framing the manager, which is the job everyone applies for. Nobody applies for a job called leader. There's no job description, right? And but you're a manager. And Heather Kirkby is a woman. She's the chief people officer for a company called Recursion Pharmaceuticals, and she used to be a product person at Intuit. And I actually spoke to her when we were doing the Candor stuff. And she'd moved into a leadership development role. She was trying to evaluate if we could be helpful. And she said, I want to restore dignity to the office of the manager. And in fact, that became a chapter title in my book. It's just, I'll never forget it, because leader is it's this culture of grandiosity everywhere. The leader, the leader, they float. They need barely whisper, follow me. And everyone magically lines up. But the manager's got thick rimmed glasses and a clip-on tie and short sleeve shirts and a leaky drop ceiling. And they're just doing spreadsheets and making sure the bottles on the Laverne and Shirley manufacturing, everybody, the manager, someone to tolerate, but the leader, part God. And so anyway, but the job is manager, right? And so she said, I want to restore dignity to the office of the manager. So I would like to reframe folks that managers aren't just people to be tolerated. Managers must lead, leaders must manage, and therefore let's just erase that really hard line that tends to exist between them in our minds.
Totally agree. Forehand and backhand. Got to do both to play a tennis game. Not that I've ever played a tennis game, but anyway, I would imagine.
You probably need an overhand. By the way, if helpful, just maybe if you want me, before we hit the A and the C, to explain a tiny bit about Qualtrics, what happened there and how it contributed.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I entered Qualtrics with a very strong theory because of the work you and I did together. So, as I don't know if anybody that listens to podcasts would know, but I usually was the first person folks spoke to when they kind of called in and were looking for us to help them out. So I don't know. I bet I had 1,000 repetitions in some form, whether it was writing people or a phone call I took. And I would always do a basic discovery question. And the discovery question was some version of, what problem are you trying to solve, or how do you think we can be helpful? And through 1,000 repetitions of that, there was a very common message. They always used different words, but the message was, we have an engagement problem related to low manager skill. And because Radical Candor had some very powerful ideas about how to, and by the way, I now know even more so how powerful. Keep teasing that idea because we're going to get to it.
Because you can measure it.
Because we can. Had some powerful ideas about managing. It made sense that they were calling us. And they were, of course, generally looking for, the 2x2 and coaching and all that stuff, or feedback guidance. And so anyway, we had the two labs that we did. We did career conversations and we did core Radical Candor. And then, I did a lot of those. And so I got a lot of feedback on them, right? And so I was able to really kind of dial in what was sort of missing for managers in the minds of folks. And then there's this direction idea too. And so anyway, I walk into Qualtrics with a pretty strong idea that what many companies believe is the specific skill gap that managers lack vis-a-vis the idea of employee engagement. I've got a head start there. I've got a head start to the theory. Now, the third-party research tells us engagement and business results are strongly correlated, and there's I don't know one person qualified to say that's not the case. It's so strong. So I get to Qualtrics. I decide, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to test these behaviors. I added this third one, so there was kind of coaching and career that were strongly informed by my time with you. Direction wasn't as strongly tested, but there's a bunch of treatment and Radical Candor around different decision-making wheel and things like that. I went a little different direction, but anyway, had a chance to test these. And and this is probably the most important idea. It's the A and the C in stack. So first I created a hiring rubric. So any manager, we selected them for their leadership chops. Love of leadership is the first question is, so why do you want to manage people? And the only wrong answer, actually I say, so why on earth would you want to manage people? And the only wrong answer is, I know, right? But, and so we're just trying to get underneath the love. But anyway, we started selecting better. We started teaching a very focused direction coaching career. And we started assessing managers from the perspective of their employees. This is the big idea. Lots of people do leadership training. Almost nobody has the gumption to allow solely employees to evaluate their managers. Employees do the work. They're the ones we're fighting to attract, develop, and retain. They're the ones being led. So they're the ones I want evaluating how the manager is leading. And so we do this by asking them if the manager was demonstrating 12 behaviors. The big three breaks down into 12 behaviors every quarter. And now we get a measurement on, we call it manager effectiveness, but now we're getting a measurement on leadership. And once you have a measurement on leadership, you can correlate that with engagement and you can correlate that with results. And what we found was incredible. And so the last part, by the way, so that's assess. You have to actually assess your managers. They will not change their behavior unless you assess them. I promise you. They're not even, most people aren't even capable. You go to training, you walk out of the room, a very small number of people are capable of a very small number of behavior changes. But when you start assessing them on a regular basis, and then you add the last part, which is coach them, there will be gaps in how they're behaving toward their teams. Now coach them to close it. Don't fire them. That's the fastest way to kill this thing, but coach them on how to close the gaps. And so select, teach, assess, coach. And it's sort of like a flywheel. It almost repeats back on itself. You kind of go back to the assess and coach part over and over and over. And your managers get better. Our managers at Qualtrics got measurably better in my 4 years there as we added 500 managers. We added 500 managers that got measurably better. And then we saw engagement follow. And obviously the company's on like 6 straight beat and raise. So I think fair to say the results tended to follow. But
yeah, you hit $1 billion in revenue. These are not soft skills. These are hard skills.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love that. I mean, look, I will say that hopefully I listened to your feedback and I started valuing the difficult to measure stuff, the leadership / management / boss capabilities. And look at you, you quantified what I didn't bother quantifying. So I guess you're the more analytical of the two of us. So can we talk a little bit more about measurement? Because there's part of me, the story I started to tell at the beginning, right when I was about to publish Radical Candor, I got well-known venture capital firm called me in, and they wanted me to try to quantify the impact of Radical Candor. And I had kind of a snarky reply. I said, look, you try to quantify the benefit of living in a beautiful house versus an ugly house. I'm not going to try. Like, I'm just going to assert that it matters. Needless to say, that firm did not become one of our customers. So not a surprise. But I do think at the core of good management is a relationship. And I do think, one of the novels that I wrote is called The Measurement Problem, about how capitalism is really good at rewarding what it can measure, really bad at rewarding what it values. And obviously, you wouldn't want to try to quantify, a relationship. I don't think, or I don't know. So what do you think?
First of all, I think it's really important that we're now talking about a specific kind of relationship, manager and employee.
So it's not a friendship.
Yeah, what I'm about to say, I would never say for any other kind of relationship. Actually, almost probably any other relationship. But what's true of all relationships is they have attributes or properties. And I think what I would argue is, first, the point of work is for us to deliver an aligned result. I mean, I that's why we're all there.
Yeah, it's not a relationship. Like the point of a marriage is a relationship.
Yeah,
but,
like if I told my wife, like, hey, V, will you marry me? I really think we could deliver some aligned results together. Like that's an automatic no, right? Right? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm a catch, but like even that's probably so. It's just different, right? Relationships have properties, and so what I'd say is maybe instead of the framing of how do you quantify a relationship, what I'd say is, how can you figure out the best behaviors to demonstrate that will lead toward the outcomes that we all want? And then how can you measure the frequency with which those behaviors are being demonstrated? And, you're probably technically measuring the relationship, as you said it. But what that manager effectiveness score really is a frequency with which your employees are experiencing you exhibiting the behaviors that we've studied to lead to better engagement and better results. And so those are the behaviors I want the managers to show. It turns out that they're built primarily around the simple idea, which is the only thing people have in common, every person has in common at work. There's only one thing, which is that they want to be successful. And when you build the relationship and the behaviors you expect from the manager around that idea, which your job is to deliver an aligned result and then enable the success of the people on your team, both short and long-term success, then suddenly it becomes clear that there's ways to do that and there's ways that aren't that. And so we're trying to measure the frequency with which those specific behaviors show up. And not because it's my pet project, but because those behaviors, we studied them, those behaviors strongly correlate with both engagement and business results. So that's kind of how I'd go about that. I recognize that I sound, I said, well, soft skills, and I was talking soft skills, and now all of a sudden I'm applying math to this idea, but I actually think it's probably the most, this is probably the most important idea in the book.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love that you measured and proved that this stuff works. So what are the 12 behaviors that you're measuring? What are the radical candor ones? What are the feedback?
Yeah, great. A couple that pop up, and by the way, these have very strong relationships with engagement. Oh, and just in case like folks don't know, I just grabbed the text from a guy I worked with at Qualtrics, and the correlation of employee engagement, a highly measurable 30-year-old IO psychological, not what you think it is or what I think it is, but like actual sort of specific idea. Correlation employee engagement to overall financial performance of a company is R squared of 0.2.
Sorry, for those of us who aren't that analytical, what the hell does that mean?
Let me do it this way. Bain and Company found that highly engaged employees drive 2.5 times more revenue than lesser engaged employees. Gallup found just recently that companies in the top quartile in employee engagement are 17% more productive revenue per head and 21% more profitable operating margin. The Royal Bank of Canada, who we used to do work for, they found in their 10,000 person technology group, so they're more cutting edge area, that an engaged employee drove 3 times more, highly engaged employee drove 3 times more revenue than a lesser engaged employee. We found at Qualtrics we turned our own EX value analysis on ourselves and found 70% of our operating margin could be explained by uniquely strong employee experience. The core measurement is employee engagement. So real like earnings per share correlates with employee engagement, like the most precious business results. Like, so a lot of people want to say engagement's a soft measure off to the side, but it's actually integral, I believe. Yeah. So the big three that's sort of the umbrella for these behaviors: direction, coaching, career. A couple of radically candid ones, specifically in coaching, are the most strongly correlated behavior with employee engagement. We get at that by asking this question: how much do you agree with the following statement? My manager frequently gives me specific praise for good work. And this has the strongest relationship with engagement. I think maybe at first blush for many, not this audience, not you, but for many, that's, well, of course, darn millennials need to constantly, be patted on the back. But it's not that at all, I don't think. I think it's the higher leveraged idea about praise that you talk about, which is reinforcing for folks what to continue. And that's the phrasing I use in the book. I call it continue coaching, because you shouldn't just assume people know what's working. You actually should tell them to give them the best chance to repeat it. By the way, byproduct is you're actually recognizing people for what they've done. And the other byproduct is, if you're going to be specific and sincere, that forces you to actually know and be able to articulate the standards that you're coaching on, both for continue and improve. I think it's little wonder that one bubbled up to the top.
Before we move on to the next one, will you tell the story of coaching Little League and the book? I love this. This is such a good story about praise. And criticism, but mostly praise.
Mostly praise. Yeah. Did you want me to tell it now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, because this is where I learned for real the power of praise. So, I was coaching Little League, Belmont, Redwood Shores, AAA, Phillies. My coaching partner and I we'd coached together a few times. Our teams were always pretty good, and we were development first, but winning matters was our philosophy, because the kids wanted to win. Like, people think kids don't want to win; they're just not paying attention. But what's development anyway without some way to evaluate, right? So we went to a seminar by the Positive Coaching Alliance, and it was great. And they said a number of things, but the one that stuck with me was 5-to-1 praise criticism. And they were careful, right? They said not 5-0, because it's not everyone gets a trophy. And they also, it's not infinity to 1, which is, this phantom notion of limitless praise. It's 5-to-1. And they talked a little bit about why, but I just said, you know what? That's the kind of coach I want to be anyway. And so I just adopted it wholesale right away. And I started keeping track of what the kids did well in the book. It was just a lab notebook, like with graph paper. It became a lot more. I mean, to the kids, it was like I was holding up Simba whenever I held the book, like, "Hare Hanya, like every time. And the kids loved. And so starting with being on time to practice, you were on time, you got your name written down. You counted loudly during stretching. When that gave way that you were doing the stretches incorrectly, we started to talk about, you got to get your head to your knee on your hamstring stretch. All the way through to fielding the ground ball, right? Move your feet, center the ball in your stance, get your glove in the dirt, cover with your throwing hand, pull it up to your shoulder as quickly as possible, back foot, front foot, throw to first. And so it turns out it's very difficult to tell someone they're doing well if you don't know what the standard is by which they're being evaluated. And so this forced us to get very clear about all the standards on the team, the technical standards, the effort standards, all the behavioral standards. And so we would, about midway through practice, or if the team was lagging a little bit, even just maybe the hustle wasn't there, the focus, we would do a session for the book. It would be about 10 minutes, bring the kids in. Here's what everybody did well. And I got to tell you, like, the energy and focus after we did the book for the rest of practice was 100% of the time superior to what it was right before we did it. And then we always did a wrap up at the end. And sometimes I'd reinforce it at night on the team website about what people did well and did, when I had time. I had this simple realization, which is it's tempting to think, oh, that's some magic that works on kids, But like, they're just small people. They're more similar to us than adult versions of of dogs, for example.
Or we're just big kids.
Or we're big kids. Either way. So yeah,
not very big in my case, but
yeah, you're still a big kid, Kim. By the way, also coach. I like the word coaching a lot because this idea that you talk about is don't say something to a person, one of your employees, that you'd say to your dog, like "good job."
Yeah,
that's what cheerleaders say. Right? Cheerleaders are on the sideline. Cheerleaders are, shouting platitudes that we repeat back. But a coach is on the field. A coach is right there with the players. It's energetic, and it needs to be specific. Like this idea of coaching and being a positive coach, coaching for praise, coaching to continue, all these ideas are the same thing to me, is really different than being a cheerleader and way more helpful to get the outcomes that you're trying to get. So little wonder praise spikes so hard on its relationship with employee engagement.
Okay, so I love that. So one behavior that you're measuring is praise.
Yeah, actually, how often do managers regularly give praise for good work? Yeah. Second most strongly correlated was in Radical Candor language is soliciting feedback. So your 4-step process for asking for feedback. And this one's so obvious, it's painful. In fact, I've thought so much. I thought, boy, to me, that's the second biggest idea in your book, by the way, because I've seen, because you just think about it, it's this simple. Nobody goes to work not wanting to be heard. And yet by accident, probably mostly, we all go to work constantly and we're constantly unheard. And that's because there's a power differential, and a manager, no matter how chill they think they are with their team, like, oh, I'm so cool, I'm trying to be like, people still are very disinclined to offer up the hard stuff. What can be better? And so when you start to ask people for that, and it's hard to get, right? It takes a little jump starting to get it going. You behave well. You respond correctly. You show that you value what you've heard and hopefully often implement what you've heard. Suddenly people see that pattern and they start to be more willing to offer it up proactively. You have to ask less because you've created a place where people feel safe to do that. But nobody goes to work saying, you know what, I hope I don't get my voice heard today. It's going to be great.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, if you think about inclusion, I don't want to go off into DEI, but inclusion, if you think about the most basic idea of what everyday inclusion is, it is where are you most likely to be included, right? It's in meetings, it's with your teammates. And what is actually transacting or transpiring in those interactions? We're discussing things, we're trying to make decisions, we're trying to, maybe help each other with the work, but all of it expected to be heard, and you want to be heard, and you're most likely to feel included if you're heard. There's quantitative backing for that statement, but it goes straight to your idea of the 4-part solicit feedback model, and it's second most strongly correlated with employee engagement. So there's a couple radically candid behaviors, very strong return on investment. By the way, improvement coaching I think it makes top 6 if memory serves.
Yeah.
People don't love that.
Yeah.
I don't care what they say. Nobody likes that.
Nobody likes giving it or receiving it.
Exactly.
And you call it improvement coaching because people can't stand the word criticism. Like that was another part. That's another part of writing a book about management. That is really hard because there's not, the word feedback is problematic. I use the word guidance, which hadn't exactly taken off in the world. Well, despite my insistence on it in the book, I didn't change. But criticism is the word that people, but that is what it is. I mean, but before we move on to criticism, I want to take another beat on soliciting feedback, because I think that if we go back to this relationship point, one of the things that is most damaging to a relationship is a power imbalance. And I think if you're the manager, one of the most important things you can do is figure out how to lay your power down so that you can get on a level playing field and get to know the people who you're working with. And I think one of the most important things you can do is to solicit feedback. That's, I think, the right place to start. So glad that was and I'm surprised praise came before soliciting feedback. I always say soliciting feedback first, but maybe you're right. I'm sure you're right. Maybe I need to change the order of operations to give praise first.
I think it's probably it doesn't matter too much one before the other. They both have an incredibly strong relationship. Another behavior is establishes explicit expectations, and so with people know with certainty what is expected. And so you start to put these things together, and you can see how they like, what are you coaching someone on if it's not the things they're explicitly expected to do or deliver, right? Like, I don't know what you're doing. You're coaching on something else. It doesn't matter, right? And so including specific praise for good work, including improvement coaching, all of these things. So yeah, so those are kind of three big ones, I would say. Those are probably three pretty big specific of the 12 behaviors. Those are three of the more leveraged.
And how do you measure engagement? How does that get measured?
Yeah, it's usually about somewhere 5 or 6 questions. It varies a little, but the questions sound like this. So one question is employee net promoter score, which is how likely are you to recommend this as a great place to work? Next one is employee satisfaction. Overall, how satisfied are you with the work that you do or with this place as an employer? Fulfillment. Overall, how fulfilled are you by the work that you do? Discretionary effort. How likely are you to go above and beyond? And pride and employer. Proud of you to work at this place. And then there's kind of a swing question, which is intent to leave, intent to stay. How much do you agree with the following statement? I am seriously considering leaving employer in the next 6 months. That one sometimes gets left out, sometimes gets included. That one's
people don't really want to know the answer to that one.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you got time, I know we're up there, but if you got time, there's another really important radical candor idea that ties to that last question that I think would knock your socks off. But
I've got time. I'm ready to have my socks knocked off.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Are you wearing socks right now?
Because I'm wearing socks and shoes. Okay. Even I'll show you. Look at this.
I don't believe it.
Let's see if I can get my leg over my head. I've got these orange shoes.
You just put those on. So those are the questions. And I know, like, I just want to give a little treatment to skepticism folks would have. I was highly skeptical that some mystical, magical measurement from IO psychology that employee engagement could matter at all. And I'm telling you, you just got to look. The research is unbelievably clear. We at Qualtrics even found this is unbelievable. We found in our sales organization, plus 5 points in employee engagement was worth 30 points of quota attainment. In our customer success group, we found plus 5 in engagement was worth 5 points of contract renewal. And by the way, we were already at about like a 90% contract renewal, well beyond world class. We also found an elasticity between that manager effectiveness score and engagement. It was plus or minus 2, plus or minus 1. So if you think about that in a sales organization, if I can improve my managers by 10 points on manager effectiveness, I should get 5 points of engagement on average, and I should get 30 points of quota attainment. I don't want to overstate it, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't exist anywhere else. Like that kind of insight about the value of practicing specific leadership behaviors.
Yeah. It seems very compelling. And there's, the truism, which gets even more true during the Great Resignation, is that people join companies but leave managers. So why does employee engagement not measure something like how likely would you be to work for this manager again, as well as for the company? I always wonder that.
Getting back to this knock your socks off moment, we actually had a hard time correlating engagement and attrition. I actually, if you probably didn't even notice, but I steered pretty clear of it.
Yeah.
I think most people do that in their heads. They tie them together. And I think practically this undervalues employee engagement by making it all about attrition retention. So we had a real hard time nailing that relationship down. That said, to your specific question, I think I'd sent you a little data actually. Qualtrics had done a study, 15,000 US respondents, and they basically did a conjoint analysis. You asked your respondents to stack rank various attributes of the workplace, in this case, specifically for where you select to work, where you're going to pick, the place you're going to pick to work. And the usual suspects are all on the list. We would guess them right now. It would be compensation, benefits, flexible work. This was done during the pandemic. Flexible work was on there. Team that you're going to work with, the company culture. But through this conjoint of 8 or 9 attributes, the direct manager was the top attribute. So the idea that you're hitting on, Kim, is out there. It's just maybe not linked to engagement. So what's interesting is engagement's not a controllable input metric like Amazon would say, but manager effectiveness is. And when you realize that manager effectiveness or measuring the frequency of behaviors delivers more engagement, then that's how you sort of affect engagement. This one leadership behavior, there was one behavior, though, that strongly correlated with retention.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I know. Like, I would imagine that a boss who's an asshole hurts retention, no?
Yeah.
Or it's more complicated.
I think that's an excellent theory. We should test it right away. So here's what happened with this intent to leave question. It's unbelievably predictive. So what we learned was that 75% of the time when someone left the company, they told us within the last 6 months they were going to leave the company. Like a lot of people think there's all this sampling bias in these questions and employees lie and they won't. They were telling us, like, I'm going to leave. And then they did. 67% of the time when they said they were going to leave, they did. So my point in that is incredibly predictive of attrition, the most predictive question we could ask. So then we said, well, what leadership behaviors correlate with that question, right? If we can't quite find a strong linkage all the way through, did a sort of a waypoint. So we use that question, and you're going to love this. How much do you agree with the following statement? My manager cares about me as a human being. It's an
much
axis.
nicer.
It's a radical candor axis. You know, that said, do you remember we laughed, like how uproariously we laughed that one time when that engineer said, how do you care about people at work? Remember we were like,
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Greatest question ever, because it turns out that actually has some unique attributes that you wouldn't pull out into your personal life necessarily. So, you remember people were always disinclined to drop the care personally. Russ, you should have seen me. I went into his office. I kicked the door in. I told my boss, you're an asshole. I was radically candid. I'm like, there you were.
That's obnoxious aggression.
That's not it at all. And so I made up that exercise to get people to tell about a time they gave radical candor. And then with a plan that they would always drop that. When they recounted their story, they would always drop the care personally, and I would just facilitate them into the care personally. That was the plan. And it went just like that. And so ultimately, when I kind of facilitated people through, I took away a couple of the layups, like, oh, they asked about my weekends, or, oh, they always go to the happy hours, all the nonsense that we normally say is care personally. 600 people, 150, bless you, 150 workshops, times 4 people per workshop that shared there, 600 people, developed a word cloud, which was time, help, success. And so the way that they felt cared about in the workplace was when their manager took the time to help them have more success, both short and long term, which, by the way, comes all the way back to this idea that the only thing we all have in common at work is wanting to be successful. And so you can't, again, like say to my wife, the way I show that I care about you as a human being is that I take the time to help you be more successful. That's not really, I don't think that really quite works in a marriage, but it works, I think, really well in a relationship at work. And so if the manager can just make sure the employee understands with clarity what's expected, and then puts every ounce of energy into enabling their success, I think that's where we get the flywheel.
Yeah. And that's sort of specifically means doing things like having one-on-one meetings, having career conversations. Is that right?
Yeah.
Are those
more
absolutely granular behaviors?
Yeah. Both of those things, actually. Yep.
Awesome. Well, Russ, I have a million more questions for you, but I want to say, I know we're at time. I want to say, first of all, thank you. I'm so excited about this book. I want to say to all all of you folks out there in podcast land, don't just buy one copy of the book, buy like 10 copies each. And if you have a big team, like buy one for everyone on your team. This is a great book, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, well, thanks for your help in editing it too. And by the way, and of course, the origin of the book is my time with you at Radical Candor. Like that's where the theory came from. I had to answer this ROI question 100 times, and it was tough. And as you know, right? And so, but building this,
I'm glad you tried to answer it. Unlike me, who's just like, well, if you want a company full of assholes, go right ahead.
Yeah, but that's an ROI.
That was my answer. I like your answer much better.
The funny thing I realized, Kim, by the way, is everybody who knows an author wants nothing more than a free signed copy of the book.
Oh, I know. And this is not very high on the care personally dimension, but I hate signing the book. It just seems like
I don't mind signing
no value add.
But what I was going to say is, but what every author needs is everyone they know to buy 10 copies of the book.
Yes. Yeah. Don't ask Russ for his signature. Just buy another 5 or 6.
No, I'll sign it. I'll sign it. I'll sign if people send me their books in self-addressed stamped envelope. I'm dead serious about this. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. This was really fun. It's good. What I guess everybody else doesn't see is there's other team members from Radical Candor on here who are at this point friends and colleagues, and so it's wonderful seeing everybody's smiling face, not just yours, Kim, and really has been the consistent theme in our relationship since 2004, when you didn't
you sweat in that interview room,
when you didn't want to interview me because I was a Marine. What has been consistent since I overcame that bias is your generosity toward me, and I deeply appreciate it.
Well, you have been equally generous, and I'm gonna tell a story you probably don't. I might not be married right now if it weren't for some feedback that Russ gave me in a one-on-one meeting. Some very courageous feedback, which is that I was in a relationship with a guy I shouldn't have been in a relationship with, and Russ just said so nicely, Kim, you're awesome. You should be with an awesome person. So. Thank you, Russ, for not being afraid to veer outside of the workplace success. And it's always a pleasure to see you and chat with you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
That was so fun to hear Kim and Russ reconnected. If you want to check out the show notes for this episode, go ahead to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, or send us feedback at podcast@radicalcandor.com. Your one tip for this episode, go ahead and don't forget to pre-order Russ's book. Hey, Russ, in your own words, give us the title and what is the point of your book?
Yeah, title is When They Win, You Win. Being a great manager is simpler than you think. And so, of course, we're going to make every manager great. Or said differently, please join me on my quest to rid the world of Ask Cloud managers everywhere.
I love Ask Clown, and you need to use that word more often and tell your editor, who's also my editor, what a good word that is.
It's a great word, and I guess the biggest question I have is it hyphenated? Ask Clown modifying the manager? Curious. No, just
it's all one word.
Words on their own.
Urban Dictionary. Urban Dictionary defines it as a contemptible person. Yeah, so it's in the Urban Dictionary, which means it's a real word.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.